August 16, 1958. Elvis Presley stood in front of his mother's casket, trying to do something he'd promised her he would do. But when his voice cracked halfway through her favorite hymn, what happened next showed the true power of gospel music and community in a way that still gives people chills more than 65 years later. The days leading up to that moment had been the darkest of Elvis's life. He was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, going through basic training for the U.S. Army when he got the call that every son dreads. His mother, Gladys, had been rushed to the hospital in Memphis. She'd been sick for months with hepatitis, her liver slowly failing, but Elvis had convinced himself she'd get better. She always got better. On August 14, 1958, at 3:15 in the morning, Gladys Love Presley died. She was only 46 years old. When Elvis got the news, witnesses said he went completely still. Not crying, not screaming, just frozen. Like if he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge it, maybe it wouldn't be real. His commanding officer immediately granted him emergency leave, and Elvis was on the first plane to Memphis. But the Elvis who arrived at Graceland that day was not the king of rock and roll. He was a 23-year-old boy who had just lost the most important person in his entire world. For 2 days, Elvis barely spoke. He sat by his mother's casket in the music room at Graceland, holding her hand, talking to her like she could still hear him. "Mama, I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I should have been here. I should have taken better care of you." The funeral was scheduled for August 16th at the Memphis Funeral Home, with burial to follow at Forest Hill Cemetery. But there was something Elvis needed to do first, something private, something that only a few people would ever witness. He needed to say goodbye to his mother in the place where she'd always felt closest to God. The East Trigg Baptist Church was a small, modest building in a predominantly black neighborhood in Memphis. It wasn't Elvis's church. It wasn't even close to Graceland. But it was Gladys's church, or at least it had been when she was younger, before Elvis became famous, before everything changed. Gladys had always loved gospel music. The real kind. The kind that came from small black churches where people sang from their souls, not from sheet music. She'd sneak into services at East Trigg when she could, sitting in the back, being welcomed by a community that didn't care that she was a poor white woman from Tupelo. They just cared that she loved Jesus and loved the music. The church's gospel choir, led by a woman named Sister Oily Davis, had become Gladys's favorite. She told Elvis stories about their singing, how it made her feel like heaven was right there in the room, how it gave her peace when nothing else could. And in those final weeks, when Gladys knew she was dying, she made Elvis promise something. "Baby, when I'm gone," she whispered to him during one of their last phone calls, "I want you to sing for me, not at the big funeral with all those people and cameras. I want you to sing in the garden at East Trigg with Sister Oily's choir. That's where I want to hear you from heaven." Elvis promised. Of course he did. He would have promised her anything. On the morning of August 16th, before the official funeral, a small group gathered at East Trigg Baptist Church. There was Elvis, his father Vernon, his grandmother Minnie Mae, a few close family friends, and Sister Oily's gospel choir, about 12 singers who had loved Gladys and were heartbroken by her death. Elvis walked into that church looking like a ghost. He was wearing his army uniform as regulations required, but his eyes were empty. He moved like he was underwater, everything slow and disconnected. People who were there said he looked like he was in shock, like his mind couldn't quite process what was happening. The casket had been brought to the church and placed at the front. It was simple, nothing fancy, just like Gladys would have wanted. Elvis walked up to it slowly, placed his hand on the polished wood, and stood there in silence for what felt like forever. Sister Oily Davis approached him gently. She was a large woman with kind eyes and a voice that could shake the rafters when she sang. She'd known Gladys for years, had sung with her, prayed with her, loved her like a sister. "Elvis, honey," Sister Oily said softly, You don't have to do this if you can't. Your mama knows how much you love her. You don't have to prove nothing." Elvis looked at her, and for the first time since arriving, there was something in his eyes besides emptiness. There was determination, or maybe it was desperation. "I promised her," Elvis said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promised I sing in the garden. It was her favorite." Sister Oily nodded. She understood. Promises made to dying mothers are sacred, unbreakable, even when keeping them might destroy you. "We'll be right here with you, baby," she said. "You just start and we'll carry you through." Elvis stood in front of the small congregation, facing his mother's casket. The choir arranged themselves behind him, ready to support him however they could. The church was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Elvis closed his eyes, he took a breath, and then he started to sing. "I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses." His voice was soft, fragile, nothing like the powerful performances he gave on stage. This wasn't a performance. This was a prayer, a goodbye, a breaking heart trying to find words for something that had no words. "And the voice I hear, falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses." Elvis's voice was shaking, but he kept going. Behind him, the choir began to hum softly, providing a gentle foundation, letting him know he wasn't alone. "And he walks with me, and he talks with me." That's when it happened. Elvis's voice cracked completely. Not just a little wavering, but a full break, like something inside him shattered. He tried to keep singing, tried to push through, but he couldn't. His throat closed up. Tears started streaming down his face. "And he tells me I am his own." The last word came out as barely a whisper, and then Elvis just stopped. He stood there frozen, staring at his mother's casket, unable to continue, unable to keep the promise he'd made to her. For a moment the church was completely silent. Everyone was holding their breath, watching this young man fall apart in front of them, not knowing what to do, how to help. And then Sister Oily's voice rose up from behind Elvis, strong and clear and full of love. "And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known." One by one, the other choir members joined in, their voices blending together in perfect harmony, taking the song that Elvis couldn't finish and carrying it forward for him. It was like they were lifting the burden off his shoulders, taking the promise he couldn't keep and keeping it for him. The sound that filled that small church was something beyond beautiful. It was transcendent. It was the sound of community, of love, of people refusing to let someone suffer alone. Every voice in that choir was singing not just to honor Gladys, but to hold up her son, to tell him without words that grief was not something he had to carry by himself. Elvis stood there listening to them sing his mother's favorite hymn, and something in him broke open. Not broke down, broke open. He began to cry, really cry, for the first time since getting the news. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. And as he cried, something remarkable happened. Sister Oily stepped forward and put her arms around Elvis from behind, still singing. Then another choir member moved closer. Then another. Soon Elvis was surrounded by these singers, these black gospel singers who barely knew him but loved his mother and understood that in grief there is no color, no fame, no barriers. There is only human pain and the human need for comfort. They sang all 3 verses of In the Garden, their voices wrapping around Elvis like a blanket, like protection, like love. They sang the way Gladys had loved to hear it sung, with soul, with passion, with the absolute certainty that on the other side of grief, there is grace. When the song ended, Sister Oily turned Elvis around to face her. Her eyes were wet with tears, but her voice was steady. "She heard you, baby," she said. "Your mama heard every word you tried to sing, and she heard every word we sang for you. That's what church is. That's what family is. We sing for each other when we can't sing for ourselves." Elvis couldn't speak. He just nodded and let this woman he barely knew hold him while he cried. But the moment wasn't over yet. Elvis, still surrounded by the choir, walked slowly to his mother's casket. He leaned down and kissed the wood, his tears falling on the polished surface. And then, in a voice so quiet that only those closest to him could hear, Elvis whispered something to his mother. The exact words were never confirmed, but Sister Oily later said she heard him say, "Mama, they sang for us, just like you wanted. They sang for us." Elvis stayed at the casket for a long moment, his hand resting on it, and then he did something that surprised everyone. He turned to the choir and spoke, his voice rough from crying but clear enough to understand. "Will you sing it one more time for her?" The choir didn't hesitate. They launched into "In the Garden" again, this time singing directly to Gladys, like they were serenading her into heaven. And this time, Elvis didn't try to join in. He just stood there, his hand on his mother's casket, letting those beautiful voices fill the church and fill his broken heart. When they finished, Elvis walked to each choir member and hugged them one by one. He couldn't find words to thank them, but they understood. Sister Oily would later say that moment in the church changed how she thought about music and ministry. "Music isn't just about sounding pretty," she told her congregation the following Sunday. "Music is about showing up for people when they're in pieces and helping them find a way back to wholeness. That's what we did for Elvis Presley that morning, and that's what we should do for anyone who needs it, famous or not." The small gathering at East Trigg Baptist Church broke up quietly. Elvis had to go to the official funeral, where thousands of people would line the streets, where cameras would capture every moment, where he would have to be Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, instead of just a grieving son. Before he left the church, Elvis pulled Sister Oily aside and pressed something into her hand. It was a piece of paper with a phone number written on it. "If you or the choir ever need anything," he said, "anything at all, you call this number." Sister Oily nodded, understanding that this was Elvis's way of trying to repay an unpayable debt, of trying to thank people who had given him something he couldn't have bought with all his money or fame. The story of what happened in that church that morning was kept quiet for many years. It wasn't in any newspapers. There were no photographs. It was too private, too sacred. But those who were there never forgot it. In the decades that followed, several of the choir members were interviewed about that day. Their accounts were remarkably consistent. They all remembered Elvis's voice breaking. They all remembered the moment when the choir stepped in to finish the song. And they all remembered the feeling in that church, a feeling of pure, overwhelming love. "He was just a boy who lost his mama," one choir member said. "Didn't matter that he was Elvis Presley. Grief don't care about your name or your fame. He needed to be held and loved and reminded that he wasn't alone. That's all any of us need when we're hurting." For Elvis, the loss of his mother was a wound that never fully healed. He would talk about Gladys for the rest of his life, always with tears in his eyes, always with the pain of that loss evident in his voice. Friends said he never got over it, that he spent the rest of his life trying to fill the hole she left behind. But in that small church on that August morning, surrounded by a gospel choir who loved his mother and had compassion for her son, Elvis experienced something profound. He experienced the true meaning of gospel music, not as entertainment but as a lifeline, as a community's way of saying, "We will not let you drown in your grief, we will sing you through it." Gospel music had always been important to Elvis. He'd grown up listening to it and recorded several gospel albums throughout his career. But after that morning at East Trigg, gospel became something even deeper. It became tied to the memory of his mother, to the kindness of strangers who became family, to the moment when he was too broken to sing and others sang for him. Years later, when Elvis recorded the gospel album How Great Thou Art, which would win him his first Grammy Award, he dedicated it to his mother's memory. During recording sessions, when the backup singers would hit a particularly beautiful harmony, Elvis would sometimes get emotional. Those who knew him understood he was remembering that morning in the church, remembering the voices that had carried him through his darkest moment. The story of Elvis at his mother's funeral reminds us that grief is not something we're meant to face alone. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone who's hurting is simply show up and be present with them in their pain. It reminds us that music, real music, music that comes from the soul, has a power that goes far beyond entertainment. Sister Oily Davis sang at many funerals in her long life, but she always said that mourning with Elvis was the most important one. Not because he was famous, but because in that moment, their little choir got to do what music is really supposed to do. We got to take someone's unbearable pain and make it bearable just for a moment. We got to remind him that he was loved, that he wasn't alone, and that his mama was in a better place. When Sister Oily passed away in 1993, her family found among her possessions a framed photograph of Gladys Presley and a letter Elvis had sent her years after the funeral, thanking her again for what she and the choir had done that day. In the letter, Elvis wrote, "I've sung in front of millions of people, but I've never felt music the way I felt it that morning in your church. You showed me what gospel really means, what grace really means. I will never forget it." Today, East Trigg Baptist Church still stands, though it has gone through many changes over the years. There's no plaque, no memorial marker about what happened there that August morning. It remains a private moment, a sacred memory held by those who were there and passed down through stories to those who came after. But for those who know the story, that small church represents something profound about Elvis Presley. It represents the man behind the legend, the son who loved his mother so much that losing her nearly destroyed him. And it represents a community's compassion, the way a group of gospel singers saw a young man in pieces and used their voices to help put him back together, if only for a moment. The promise Elvis made to his mother to sing in the garden at her funeral was both kept and broken that day. He couldn't finish the song himself. His grief was too overwhelming. But in a way, that made the promise even more beautiful, because it showed that keeping promises doesn't always mean doing things alone. Sometimes keeping promises means accepting help. Sometimes it means letting others carry you when you can't walk on your own. And sometimes, when your voice breaks, the most beautiful thing that can happen is for other voices to rise up and finish your song.